Sorry, I didn't mean to get everybody's attention. Someone's running late, and it's not the other speakers. But go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm not the Attorney General. My name is Michael Waterstone. I'm the dean here. Thank you guys so much for coming out today. We realize, how many students? Show of hands? Most? Okay, terrific. We realize it's a competitive market for your lunch business, and we're grateful that you chose the orange boxes in democracy over whatever was in one room over. So I'm going to make this relatively informal. I do want to start, before we continue, I want to acknowledge that UCLA law sits on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. As members of a land-grant institution, we at UCLA pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives past, present, and emerging. So we will be joined in a bit by the Attorney General. We're really grateful that given his busy schedule, he's making the time for us. We're also grateful for his participation here at UCLA. He's a former commencement speaker, and for his engagement on this issue, democracy. So I'll stop with that relative to him because he's not here, and let me say a few words about the two folks.
We'll tell him that you said
yeah, box checked. So to my left, how many of you have Professor Hasen in the class? Okay, so you have a sense of who he is and what a gifted teacher he is. I've known Rick forever. I'm grateful to call him a colleague and a friend. And I really think it's not an understatement to say Rick is doing some of the most important work in the country and by implication world right now. More than any time, certainly in my lifetime, the idea of democracy and in particular the machinery of elections is under stress and under attack. And Rick has been truly a global leader, not just in himself kind of giving direction and opining, but the real gift of what Rick does is convening others and bringing together folks in a nonpartisan fashion, which is almost a completely impossible word to use right now, but really bringing together folks from all over the political spectrum to say, regardless of how we hope the election comes out, we all need to have a baseline level that we want a kind of free and fair election, which is so vital to our democracy. So I'm just so appreciative of the work that Rick is doing. He stands on that wall, so hopefully the rest of us don't have to. So thank you, Rick. Next, we have Stephen Cobb. Stephen is joining us all the way from DC. He's a member of the law firm Cozen O'Connor and the inaugural American Bar Association Democracy Fellow. He has a long record of public service at the very highest levels. This includes work as the Deputy Attorney General of Virginia, a senior advisor to the director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, general counsel of the Democratic Party of Virginia, and special counsel to Rock the Vote. So Stephen, thank you for being here. Rick, thank you for all that you're doing. And Attorney General, just generally thanks. So with that, I'm gonna give the Attorney General his seat back. And thank you all for being here and move on to the next thing. Thanks, guys.
I should say that we're expecting Attorney General Bonta in about 10 minutes. We'll see if that holds. You all have seen the traffic on Sunset, but
with elected officials, 10 minutes usually means 20, but will suffice. Thank you all so much for having me here and for coming to hear about what we can do to strengthen our democracy. When the ABA started its Defending Democracy initiative in 2022, it was really focused on what we can do to protect election workers. It has expanded to all of the myriad issues that continue to strain and stress test our democracy. And so when they asked me if I would serve as an inaugural democracy fellow, they did so really with the purpose that I would shine a light on the people on the front lines and the people who have been carrying this laboring oar like Rick for so many years and are really on the forefront. So I've had one of the easier jobs, which is to help convene people smarter than I and talk about what they're doing to protect and strengthen our democracy. And also make sure that those who tune in, and those of you here in person, and those who are streaming live, thank you for being here. And hopefully, through our discussion, we can talk a little bit more about some of the challenges facing our democracy and the role we can all play. The first panel where I was wearing my role as the ABA Democracy Fellows at the ABA's mid-year meeting in Louisville. And I said to those in attendance that lawyers are essential stewards of democracy. And I think that is so very vital as we sit here in UCLA's law school, and I see those of you here who are going to be very successful lawyers. Some of you might be in the election space. Some of you might work for government entities that have a role to play. But regardless of whether you're the most high-power, high-profile corporate transactional lawyer, or whether you are litigating voting rights, there is a role for all of you to play in how that strengthens and protects our democracy. And now I was looking at something, and, you know, as law students, I'll make this specific to you. You're going to be the butt of many lawyer jokes as you go through law school.
They already are, don't worry.
And most of the time, particularly when I was a law student, when I was a young lawyer, can usually just chuckle at most of them or roll my eyes. But one of the few that has always irritated me is when someone says, Shakespeare had it right, you should kill all the lawyers. Also because it's misquoted, and it is not the point of that dialogue. It was from Henry VI, and former Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John Paul Stevens, said it succinctly. Shakespeare insightfully realized that disposing of lawyers is a step in the direction of a totalitarian form of government. So when people say to you, Shakespeare right, kill all lawyers, that was said in jest, because lawyers are the front lines of democracy. So that is a very broad introduction to the ABA's Defending Democracy program. And I'm excited to be here with you, Professor Hasen, for all of the work and scholarship you've done over decades, both domestically and internationally. One of the things I thought we would kick off talking about is kind of bucketing some of the challenges that come with us. And in one of your books, you've talked about the need for greater civic education, both amongst our youth and amongst adults as professionals. And so I wonder if you can talk and help me bucket a few of the challenges, those which involve the need for greater education, those are which we might need for legal reform, and those are which are structural impediments. And I thought that maybe we could discuss a little bit about each one of those buckets.
Sure, and thanks to all of you for coming, and I do hope that, the main attraction will appear, and I'm like the opening act.
Is the main attraction.
Yeah. They see me all the time. But at least you got a lunch, right? So that's something we're really good at, giving you a box. But, I was thinking about this, thinking about how when you go back to 2020 and you talk about the invasion of the Capitol, and you talk about what happened before that with the attempt to change electoral college votes. That's something that if you don't have a civics education and you don't understand how our government works, you can't make sense of any of this. You can't understand, like, well, what do you mean that there's people that meet in a room and they have to send this document to the vice president? It's like, it's all this arcane stuff. And if you don't have an appreciation for the kind of the nuts and bolts of how things work, you don't even know what the Electoral College is, and unfortunately, if you look at polling, most people can't explain what the Electoral College is, then it's going to be really hard to figure out how your democracy is going to work. So the very first thing is people need to know, and I know at least in California, when I was in high school here, we had a lot of civics education. We actually learned about government, and now students get very little of that. And so where are they going to get it? That they're not going to get it from TikTok. They're not going to learn, how. So I'm concerned about just the lack of just knowledge. And then the other thing is, back in 2008, or I guess it was 2009, George W. Bush was a conservative Republican. He finished his 2 terms in office, and Barack Obama, a liberal Democrat, was elected in the next election. And before Obama was sworn in, the Bushes invited the Obamas for coffee at the White House. They went over, they had a nice day, peaceful transition of power. It was a celebratory moment. Nobody was asking, is George W. Bush going to leave the White House? You know, there was this moment when the Obamas waved to the Bushes, and the Bushes go on Marine One and fly off to, you know, begin the post-presidential. Like, even if those of us who are educated and understand how democracy works, we take for granted that a democracy is going to continue to work, that votes are going to be fairly counted, that the winner is going to be the person who takes office. A lot of these things are up for grabs in a way that they weren't before. Some of that is structural. Some of that is cultural. We talked about this in our panel last week on race and election subversion. Some of it is technological, that we're in a very different era now where it's much easier to spread false claims about elections being manipulated. And this undermines voter confidence. So we face myriad challenges, you know, educationally, in terms of our rules, as well as in terms of the norms and culture in our society, especially as we're polarized and as technology is changing.
I've had to do some work internationally over the last 2 years. And so I was speaking at a symposium in Abuja, Nigeria, with the National Judicial Institute on the role of courts in resolving election disputes. And then last year I was in Moldova, completing a time as a Fulbright specialist. And part of that included lectures on the American electoral process and in voting rights. And one of the things that I think continues, or was that unique in both, was that America is still the gold standard internationally to many of these young, even younger democracies when they talk about voting rights and elections. But it is only that way because we continue to work at it. Whether that be through constitutional amendments, whether that be through change in statutes, both at the state and federal level, it is always a continuing work in progress. And so, Rick, when we talk about some of those goals, whether that is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, trying to deal with the fallout from Shelby, what are some things that we look at from both a federal and at a state level that we can do from a legislative perspective to address some of these issues?
Sure. And you know, one of the first things to note, and it should be fairly obvious, is that we have a really decentralized election system, right? So not only do we not have 51 elections, right? We don't have one election. We don't have 51 elections. DC, not forgetting DC.
Thank you, thank you.
Do you live in DC?
I do.
Okay. And we have...
I don't matter is what he was getting.
You matter for the presidential election, just not for Congress. We have something like 8,000 elections, right? So LA County is kind of the unit here. If you go to a place like Michigan, it could be at the township level. I think they have something like 1,600 units of government. I mean, so when you talk about changing election rules, we have this diffuse power, right? So some of the rules are set by our Constitution. Those are very high-level rules, right? You can't discriminate on the basis of race or sex and who's allowed to vote. There's federal statutes like the Voting Rights Act. And then the states have a bunch of rules, and then the localities have a bunch of rules. And even within states, power is diffuse. So a few years ago at the Supreme Court, there were a couple of lawsuits over North Carolina passing a voter ID law, and whether or not it was a violation of the Constitution, the US Constitution, in terms of equal protection. And before the court could actually address that issue, there was a fight over who could represent the state of North Carolina at the Supreme Court. Was it going to be the Democratic governor, or was it going to be the Republican legislature? And the court had to resolve that issue before they could resolve the merits. So it's worth a step back. You're talking about traveling internationally. If you think about, you know, peer democracies, democracies that are well established, think about Canada or Germany or France or the UK or Australia. They don't have what we have. They have a national system for running elections that is generally run by a nonpartisan set of bureaucrats. They don't have exploding litigation like we have. They don't have fights over whether or not Right, so if you go to England, you know, where they've had Brexit, they're fighting really a lot. They're very polarized over there, like we are here. But they're not asking, are we going to have a fair election? Right? So we've got this problem. And so you ask about legislation. Well, you know, like in Washington State, and some of my students are involved with the UCLA Voting Rights Project. Washington State has now passed a State Voting Rights Act. And yesterday, the Supreme Court rejected a challenge to the constitutionality of that act. California has a Voting Rights Act. That's great. Louisiana does not have a Voting Rights Act, nor does Alabama. And, you know, both of those were states where people have had to go to the Supreme Court to fight over the application, not of new legislation, but of existing legislation under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So we've got this decentralized system, we've got these laggards who are not fully protecting voting rights, and we have polarization. When Congress passed the 2006 amendments to the Voting Rights Act, they passed in the Senate by a vote of 96-0. There used to be bipartisan consensus on voting rights. Now it's become partisan. You mentioned the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, among other things. That law would reverse, in part, the Shelby County decision of the United States Supreme Court in 2013 that said a part of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional because it was no longer tied to timely evidence of discrimination. It needed to be redone. Well, there's no movement now. It's become completely partisan. So you can get change in states, and I think people should advocate for change in states. That's one of the things I argue in my new book, that the way to build support for a constitutional amendment to more fully protect the right to vote is to start at the state and local level. But national legislation right now, it's not going to happen. I'll say one more thing. Just on Friday, Mike Johnson, who, depending on what time it is, he's still the Speaker of the House. That might change by the end of the day. Mike Johnson went down to Mar-a-Lago to meet with Donald Trump, whose support he needs to stay in power. And he said he's going to try to pass a law that would require that people prove their citizenship before they can register to vote. Now, you already have to prove your citizenship. You sign under penalty of perjury, I am a citizen, when you fill out a voter registration. But what he's probably talking about, we don't have the details yet, is you have to show your papers. So, you know, when you're outside of Costco and they ask you to register to vote, you probably don't have your driver's license, driver's license, not good enough, your birth certificate with you, or your naturalization papers. You usually don't have those on a Saturday afternoon with you. And we know that in Kansas, when Kansas tried to put a law like this in place, 30,000 people were essentially disenfranchised until a federal court intervened. So there's legislative proposals on both sides, but we're not seeing a lot of common sense legislation. I'll say one more thing. We did see one piece of important legislation that was passed by Congress, at least in the Senate on a bipartisan basis, at the end of 2022. It's called the Electoral Count Reform Act. Probably none of you besides my election law students in this classroom have heard of it. The Electoral Count Reform Act changes the kind of technical ways in which Congress counts the Electoral College votes. And it affirms that the vice president can't just throw out Electoral College votes. This was all a response to what happened in the post-election period in 2020. But what I see now is that rather than expanding voting rights, we've kind of had to regroup and fight retrogression of voting rights. So now it's not about, well, how are we going to have, a system where it's going to be easier for eligible people to vote? We're now asking, how are we going to assure that we don't have an election stolen? And that's really a bad place to be.
And it kind of gets us to the chicken-egg discussion around legislative policy. And I'm going to use the example you were talking about showing your papers. In the litigation that came out of Kansas when General Cobb was Secretary of State, and you can correct me on this, when it went to the federal courts and they discussed about whether or not you have to show that this is actually a problem that you were fixing, or whether there's just a onerous hurdle to those who would be trying to register to vote. Looking in your crystal ball, how would you see federal legislation playing out in the same way that kind of microcosm of the Kansas legislation played.
Right, well, so in the Kansas legislation, one of the big arguments against what Kansas was doing was that it conflicted with federal law. Because federal law requires that something called the National Voter Registration Act, or the Motor Voter Law of 1993, which says that state election officials have to accept, among other things, voter registration forms that are provided by the federal government. Like a very basic form is something called a postcard you can fill out. And that postcard, if you register by mail, you have to provide some ID, and the first time you vote, you have to provide some ID. So there are safeguards in place there. But so one of the main issues was federal preemption, that states don't have the power to do this. Of course, if the federal government passed such a law, then there wouldn't be a preemption issue.
Right.
There wouldn't be a supremacy issue. What we would have only is the Constitution. And so this gives me a chance to note that the United States Constitution contains no affirmative right to vote. There's no part of the Constitution that says you have the right to vote for president or for any office. In fact, in the 2000 Bush versus Gore case, the case that ended the dispute over the 2000 election, the Supreme Court said, the Constitution doesn't give voters the right to vote. It's state legislatures get to set the rules. They could pick the electors themselves. Even though states have given that power to voters, states can take it back in a future election at any time. So it's like, that is unusual. So you look in the Canadian Constitution and it says, every adult, everyone who's 18 years old who's a citizen gets to vote for the parliament. Or you look in Germany, who gets to vote for the parliament over there? Anyone who's 18 who's a citizen, right? So we don't have that. Our voting rights are framed in the negative, right? So they're framed as, if you're going to hold an election, don't discriminate on the basis of race. Never mind that the Supreme Court didn't enforce that for 70 years, so the Voting Rights Act. But it's framed in the negative. So we're already at a disadvantage. So where do most of our protections from voting rights come from? They come from the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, as it was originally understood, was not meant to apply to political rights. It was meant to apply to what were called civil rights. And so how could it apply to voting rights? Because in the 1960s, we had the Warren Court. The Warren Court, living constitutionalists, all of you law students have heard about this before, they read voting rights along with many other rights very capaciously. And they created something like an affirmative right to vote, at least for adult, citizen, resident, non-felons. But those precedents before this Supreme Court, if they come back to be questioned, I don't know that they're going to have legs. So if you ask me under the Equal Protection Clause whether such a law, if it's challenged, would be struck down, I think the answer would be no before this court.
What standard do you think they would use?
So the Supreme Court has drawn a distinction, and I should say we've gotten further word that the Attorney General is further delayed, so at least you got a lunch. I apologize. This was, the Supreme Court has kind of on two tracks has said things about the Equal Protection Clause and voting. It said that when you hold an election, if you try to actually disenfranchise someone, you can't vote because you can't pass, you can't pay a poll tax, or you can't vote because you don't own property. Those laws have been struck down under strict scrutiny. But when it comes to laws that make it harder for people to vote or to register to vote, those laws are subject to a sliding scale approach, where the amount of burden, I'm sorry my election law students are not happy to hear this again, although it's on the final, so they should hear it. A sliding scale approach where the amount of scrutiny that gets applied is commensurate with the burden on voters. And the leading case here is a case out of Indiana called Crawford versus Marion County Election Board, where the Supreme Court looked at a really strict voter ID law. It said, if you're so poor that you can't afford to get the ID that you need to be able to vote, you can vote and cast a provisional ballot, and then you could go at your own expense within 10 days of the election to travel to the county seat to sign an affidavit. You can't sign it at the polling place. You have to go, and you have to do it every election. You can't just sign it once, I'm poor, I can't afford it. You have to go every election, or if you have a religious objection to being photographed, so you don't have a photographic kind of ID, every election you have to go. Supreme Court said, no, that's not a constitutional problem.
No matter how far it was. It
Right.
could have been, a 30-minute drive.
Sure, and at your own expense.
Right.
So if you're so indigent that you can't afford to get the birth certificate that you need to get the free ID card at the DMV, you're probably not going to be getting on the bus. And the problem in that case was there weren't a lot of voters who seemed to be disenfranchised. The Kansas case is a case where it was much easier to show disenfranchisement. But the problem with the Crawford case is that the standard that was imposed by the Supreme Court in that case is really deferential to the states. It puts a thumb on the scale favoring the states. The states can say voter fraud. The states can say voter confidence without actually having to prove that these laws would actually promote election integrity or promote voter confidence. And there's reason to believe that they might not satisfy that.
I think part of the challenge there also is getting the data that shows the burden. In many respects, it ends up kind of being trying to prove a negative of the people that didn't get the ID and therefore couldn't vote, which I think creates that extra legal burden. We've touched on some of the issues that are kind of legal hurdles and challenges as they exist, but I want to go back to that, which is the civic ones. And I run into this, quite a bit, but it is an echo chamber of ideas, whether or not they actually exist in reality, as to the strength and security of the election system as it exists today, without change, without any of the new legislation, any of the nationalization that we've discussed. And so how much of this is, in your mind, for lack of a better description, a kitchen table issue, right? It is hearing from people that one knows and trusts about how the system actually works, what those safeguards are and aren't. I run into this quite a bit, as I'm sure you do, and it is getting together with friends or extended family and something comes up, and all eyes turn to the one person that they think maybe knows a little bit more. But how much can be done in communities, around the kitchen table, at the local health club when we're talking about these issues that face us from more of a communal and civics perspective as opposed to those which are really in their heart legal.
Sure. So, there's two questions about, let's put it in the context of 2024. One is, are we going to be able to hold a fair election where votes are going to be accurately counted? And on that score, I'm pretty confident. Even though the attrition rate of election officials has been high because people have been threatened and harassed. Why would they want to serve in office? Even though there's been some turnover. Remember, in 2020, when we held the last election, it was during COVID. A lot of rules were changed. We had social distancing at polling places. Some elections were delayed. The mail was a big problem. We expanded mail-in balloting. That was a big source of a lot of claims of fraud. Hopefully we're not having another pandemic before November. Maybe I shouldn't say that out loud. Things are in place, and most election officials do a pretty good job on very little resources. But the second question is, are people going to believe the vote totals that they're actually fair, or they're going to try and challenge them like that? And this goes to the question of trust. And so what you're asking is, how do you build trust in a system? So one of the things, we put together an ad hoc group of law professors, political scientists, computer scientists, historians, from the left and the right, got everybody in a room, and we started talking about what can we do about these issues, and we issued a report. You can find it if you Google 24 for 24, because there were 24 people coming up with 24 recommendations for 2024. I thought that would be catchy. And one of the key ones is that election officials need to be made more prominent on social media as the official source of information. And so I can give an example here. In 2022, we had midterm elections in Arizona. And there was a snafu at some of the polling places with a voting tabulation machine. So after you voted, you put your machine into the ballot, and it didn't work right. And there were all these conspiracy theories flying around. So the person who's running elections, Stephen Richer, and Bill Gates, not that Bill Gates, a different Bill Gates, who's one of the Maricopa County supervisors, they made a video in real time that they distributed over official Maricopa County, Arizona channels, explaining what happened, telling people what to do if they worried about their vote being counted, and they got the word out in real time. So it's about getting trusted people who get their messages out. Let's bring this to lawyers for a second. One of the things that's going on around the country, there's a group that Ben Ginsberg, he's the former lawyer for John McCain and Mitt Romney's campaigns, longtime Republican lawyer at Jones Day, Patton Boggs, very well-established Republican lawyer, and Bob Bauer, who was White House counsel for Obama and is Biden's lawyer and is Obama's lawyer. The two of them, they're done fighting their wars. They're both kind of semi-retired. Maybe they wouldn't like that label. But one of the things they're doing is they're organizing civic leaders around the country, lawyers and others, who can vouch and say, I know the election officials. This is a person of integrity. There are safeguards. So trying to, this is one of the things we learned about misinformation, trying to pre-but the whole claims of fraud and problems that could occur by saying, here's how we know the system is safe. And then if something happens, to be able to, in real time, respond to those things. So I think there is a movement in place to try to deal with this. Now, even those movements are then attacked as somehow trying to steal the election. I mean, this is a problem. There was an article that appeared in Time magazine after the 2020 election was all over. I'm sure you're familiar with this article, which basically said there were people around the country that were worried about someone trying to mess with the election, and they did wargaming, and they did all of this kind of trying to figure out how to make things safe. And this article, which described ways to try to protect democracy in 2020, is pointed to as a deep state conspiracy to try to steal the election. So in this environment, you're not going to reach everybody. But it's about how to get the kind of the person in the middle who's like, well, I heard there were problems. Should I be worried? What can you say to assure me? That's who your audience needs to be.
No, I think that's an excellent point, and it gets back to that underlying thing that I started out with in Louisville and that I started out with here today, which is that lawyers are essential stewards of democracy. Our job, whether that is voting or whether that is litigation in general or whether that is a complex transaction, part of the role we play is ensuring integrity of the process. And that is as much for those people who are living it as election officials or litigating on behalf of their candidate or their party, but to be able to say that we might have lost an election, but that does not mean that the process was unfair. And there was a joint report similarly titled that focused on those issues. And one of those additional challenges, and we've hit on this when we talk about that which is a national standard and that which is our states, and why this continuing dialogue I think is so vital with your friends and your family and your colleagues, because people know what they see and what they experience. And so how you vote in Michigan is going to be different than how you vote in Georgia. Some people are going to see a voting center, and that is going to be anathema to everything that they've understood. And I think we saw this a lot in 2020 when it came to vote by mail. And so all of a sudden, people are hearing that people are voting in a manner that they're not used to and haven't had to deal with before. As lawyers, we have the wonderful advantage of being able to separate fact from fiction. Well, actually, no, voting by mail isn't a conservative or a liberal proposition. It's something that's been successful in some states that are traditionally red versus blue and vice versa. And it goes into, again, ensuring that process and making sure that we are the ones who stay informed, and whether that is as part of our vocation or whether that is in part of our personal lives, we can deal with that in a very constructive manner. I want to pivot just a little bit and talk about what, if anything, can be done about the role of misinformation. Sometimes that's
But before you go there, I want to say something about lawyers, because I think it's especially because you're ABA and we've got some almost lawyers in the room, which is that, and Professor Cummings, some of you may know Professor Cummings, lawyers are central now in trying to protect democracy. I think about the John Eastman attempts to disbar him with the state bar. The same thing's happening with Jeffrey Clark, who was one of the DOJ officials who was going to try to spread false information about the Georgia election being fraudulent. Also, defamation lawsuits. Defamation lawsuits brought by lawyers, by groups like Protect Democracy against Rudy Giuliani for the claims he made about Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss. Defamation suit against Fox News from the voting machine companies. Just saw one of those settled today. So it seems to me, maybe I'll turn around and ask you,
Please.
it seems to me that there's a lot of opportunities for lawyers to be involved in trying to protect democracy and the rule of law.
Absolutely.
How can that be done? I mean, this is something I struggle with, without appearing partisan.
Sure.
So, you're a former Democratic official.
I am.
It's like, I have a hard time sometimes attracting Republicans to speak at events, in part because there's a split in the Republican Party, and when you have the leader of the party saying things about stolen elections, it's a very difficult atmosphere to try to get, as the ABA tries to do, a nonpartisan or bipartisan approach to these issues.
Absolutely. There's times when you wear a partisan hat and times when you need to be nonpartisan, and both have their role. And I think it's important to understand really where that is and what those are and are not. And as lawyers, when we're participating, there are many organizations, be that the ABA or Lawyers Committee, Rock the Vote, nonprofits, nonpartisan organizations that are focused around one thing only, which is the process. And so when we look at these organizations and what they're doing, the ABA has a role for lawyers to help represent election officials who come under physical threat of violence. And so these people are scared, they are just trying to do their civic duty, and they are bombarded with obstacles and threats that they never imagined could come along with these roles. And so there's the opportunity for lawyers to get in, talk them through what their options are, and hopefully put them on a path where they're feeling safe and supported. It is increasingly challenging to get people who are wearing their partisan hats to find public agreement. So that doesn't mean that we can't continue to try. And sometimes that means finding areas of common agreement, whether that is the very simplest, smallest morsel of how do we protect deployed militaries from voting. And maybe you start there, and then you realize that you have a lot more in common. I have found, as you mentioned, I've worn a partisan hat, and I represented the Democratic Party of Virginia for several years as their outside general counsel. I can't remember a single occasion where I had a disagreement with my counterpart for the Republican Party of Virginia or the lawyers representing their candidates on the process. We represented our clients zealously, but we were able to agree on process and how elections, canvasses, and recounts were to occur in the Commonwealth. And which is why I think lawyers, again, are so vital to this prospect, particularly litigators. We are trained to disagree without being disagreeable.
You haven't met some of the lawyers I've met.
They very well exist, and then not to be discounted. But there are more of us nationally who can vehemently advocate for our clients without attacking the process, who can agree on a path forward, even though we might be disappointed in the result. And I think that is increasingly vital. I do want to pivot to talk about misinformation a little bit, because that is both that gets back to our issue of civics education, but that also gets into a new area that we all experienced in 16 and 20, which is interference by foreign governments and international actors. So obviously we have our own obstacles when it comes to increasing the civic engagement amongst our own citizens, but that should be an obstacle in and of itself. But what is, whether as lawyers or our governmental institutions, what can we be doing to try and filter out foreign interference in the electoral process?
Well, we do know that other governments want to influence the outcome of our elections. This has been well documented. It goes back probably before 2016, but with the rise of social media by 2016, it became much more of an issue. One of the things that Congress could do is change the laws, because if you go back and you look at the Facebook ads that the Russian government operatives were funding in 2016 to try to convince people not to vote for Hillary Clinton, most of those ads were not illegal. They didn't fall under the very technical definitions of what counts as campaign spending that would be subject to being prohibited under the rules. So certainly the rules could be tightened. But it raises some difficult questions. So for example, we might say, we don't think foreign governments should be able to send messages to us to try and influence who we vote for. What if the Guardian newspaper, right, or some newspaper elsewhere in the world, in Mexico or in Australia, wants to have an editorial saying, Donald Trump would be great for the relationship of our country, or Joe Biden should be elected. How are we going to treat that? How do we deal with actual information? So there's kind of two issues, right? One is, do we think that foreign individuals shouldn't be able to participate in our elections by speaking or sending us messages? And the other is about the question of false information, or the question of impersonation. So when Russian government operatives were trying to influence in 2016 and saying, don't vote for Hillary Clinton, they posed as black activists in the United States. That seems to me is more of a problem, but that would also be a problem, I think, if it was coming from a domestic source. Right. So I think we have to kind of disentangle these things and ask, what is the problem that we, the people, are the ones who should have this debate and it shouldn't be broader? And so we shouldn't hear foreign voices? Or is the problem one of misinformation or disinformation? And if it's that, then that's not a problem that's limited to foreign sources. And then you run into the question of how do we square all of this with the First Amendment? So let me tell you about a case I just filed an amicus brief in. Do we have any updated timing?
Should be same time as was soon, very soon.
Very soon, by at least 1:30 or 1:40.
I was told 1:15, and I was told a minute ago still 1:15. So.
Okay, all right. So hopefully this will be the last thing I will say. So there was a guy in 2016 who posted memes and other messages on social media directed to African American voters, telling them Hillary's great or something like that. Vote by text. Text your vote to with a number. And he was put on trial and convicted of violating a law that goes back to the time of the Ku Klux Klan, after the Civil War, for injuring someone in their constitutional rights. Used to be like, we're going to restrain you and not let you get to the polling place. We're going to threaten you with violence. What about using fraud to disenfranchise people? And he was convicted of a crime, and on appeal to the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, his lawyers from Jones Day are arguing that the law is unconstitutionally overbroad. It violates the First Amendment. And one of the arguments, I did a brief with Protect Democracy and the Yale Media and First Amendment Clinic, and we took the view that lies about when, where, or how people vote may be constitutionally limited. It's different to lie and say, you know, my opponent voted for tax increases 14 times. Like, let the campaign sort that out. But if you tell people Democrats vote on Tuesday, Republicans vote on Wednesday, if you trick people into, you know, mail your ballot here to a different place and then it goes in the garbage, that should be a crime. And in fact, actually is a crime under these statutes. So we'll see. But I think that is a good dividing line, not necessarily even the foreign domestic, but the question of
Ladies and gentlemen, the Attorney General of California. Gentlemen.
why don't we switch seats?
Sure.
Because I think you should ask him most of the questions. People heard enough.
Thank you. You can sit right here.
Good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Hi.
Bonta.
General, thank you so much for being here with us today. We're talking about challenges facing American democracy. We were just focusing on the struggles of misinformation and how much of this is something that should be legislated and how much of this is something that we can already flex regulatory muscles on, and how much of this is just civic integrity. But I want to give you the floor for a minute. If you want to just kind of share some general thoughts that you think are some of our challenges to the strength and functioning of our democracy, and we can kind of go from there a little bit.
Sounds good. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Rob Bonta, California Attorney General. And thanks for your interest in protecting our democracy. Something I've been thinking about a lot, actually, and will, I think, continue to think about as we march forward into this calendar year, closer to that November elections. And over the last few years have definitely concluded that our democracy has been stress tested and has survived so far. And I think that's good. The foresight of our forefathers has led us into a place where there's the ability to be resilient and withstand challenges. And there are very important components. In my view, our separation of powers has been critical. Legislative, executive, and judicial branch, particularly the judicial branch that can provide remedies when there's disputes and challenges. Our free press has been very important as well, and certainly the power of the people in the end, where the full power of our democracy emanates from. And I think there's a number of different challenges that we face. One is our lack of commitment to facts as part of an acceptable and more normalized type of dialogue, and I've seen that change. There was, everyone is absolutely entitled to their own opinion. You are absolutely not entitled to your own facts. But that second part has changed. Facts are optional. People start with a predetermined narrative and a conclusion and a position, and they choose the facts that support that. They often ignore the facts that completely undermine and counter their position. And so my view has always been you start with the facts and you derive a conclusion from those facts, but you can't just ignore important facts. And disinformation, misinformation, social media platforms all helps fuel this sort of new norm of facts being optional. And it's a problem. Very significant things that you would not think are up to debate, for debate when the entire scientific community agrees on something, like the public health necessity of a vaccine during an international pandemic. All of the health professionals were saying you should take the vaccine. That's our pathway forward. It's safe. But then people would do research on Facebook, and where there's not health professionals or MDs or doctors or physicians, and that's where they would learn their truth that they wanted to follow. The same with climate change. People are denying the irrefutable climate science around climate change, or take the big lie. that Trump should be the president now, Biden stole it. People are sure of that, and that is their truth and their facts. So it's hard to have a robust democracy when you can't agree on the base foundation of what we're even talking about. So that continues to be a threat. That how we address misinformation and disinformation, I think, certainly up for debate. I absolutely think that social media platforms can take a greater responsibility. You know, there's a difference between what they should do as good citizens, as participants in a robust democracy, in my view, the most powerful and important democracy in the history of the world, and what they must do. So yes, they can hide behind First Amendment, they can hide behind Section 230, they can have all sorts of legal arguments why they aren't required. Let's just put that aside. I don't agree, but I'll concede that you don't have to do some things. But why wouldn't you want to do some things to help our democracy thrive and make sure that we're all dealing with facts instead of a platform being an engine for misinformation, disinformation, and counterfactual scenarios? So facts is sort of, or lack of adherence there too, one major challenge to democracy. Another is, I talked about the three branches. One of them is weakening, in my view, the judicial branch. It is supposed to be apolitical, it is supposed to be dispassionate, it is supposed to be a place, a tribunal, where anyone can make their arguments and the facts and the law as fairly and applied with integrity implemented, you would get an outcome. And so during the Trump administration, there were states like California. My predecessor in the California Attorney General's office sued Trump when they believed he violated the law, when he overstepped his authority, when he violated the Constitution, and won in court regularly, over 100 cases. And courts who were fairly determining the outcomes to those cases ordered the executive branch, the Trump administration, to come back into compliance with the law. That's how it's supposed to work. It's not always working that way now. There's a reason why certain cases are always brought to the same courts. They know the judge is there and they know what the outcome is going to be before they bring it. That's why the Eastern District of Texas and the Fifth Circuit is a pathway for challenging reproductive freedom, because they know they're going to win at the trial level, then they know that they're going to win at the circuit level, and with this Supreme Court, they know they have a good chance at the Supreme Court level. It shouldn't be that way. You shouldn't know the outcome before you arrive at the tribunal. It should be wide open to the inspection and review and analysis of the judge who's implementing it fairly, considering all the arguments. It should not be outcome determinative before you arrive. That's a problem. That exists in this state as well. There's a judge who makes very predictable decisions on gun laws, and is chosen because he does. And so that I see that part of our democracy, that check, that balance, that bulwark weakening to some degree. And then finally, the enemy of democracy, the biggest threat to democracy is not one person or one party, although I can think of a person and a party that, in my humble view, are challenging democracy.
We're keeping it nonpartisan.
In the interest of nonpartisanship, the enemy is apathy, the lack of activism, of democratic activity, of advocacy. When people throw up their hands and say, what I say doesn't matter, my voice won't be heard, I'm frustrated by the elected officials or the gridlock or the ultra-partisanship or the focus on TikTok views instead of real solutions to my challenges, so I'm gonna withdraw and withhold and not participate. That's when democracy dies. When people who fuel it pull away and withdraw from it. When people are active and lean in and hit the streets and go to the polls and engage their officials and hold them accountable and raise their voices and say we cannot accept the unacceptable and push for change. See the civil rights movement, see the farm worker movement, see the anti-war movement. That's when change happens. It's often fueled by students, it's often fueled by activists, it is often fueled by people without any special titles or powers or authority, besides the inherent, incredible, powerful and potent authority of being a citizen of this country who can vote and being active and speaking out. And so I see people being frustrated You can see it at the polls, at the midterms, when there was very low turnout in many places throughout the state. Not an inconsequential election. There were primaries that were uncontested, so the top wasn't contested. Maybe November, more people will come out. But there was a really important U.S. Senate race here in California, with some distinctions and differences between the choices. There's always important races at the local level. And my view has always been that people have fought and died for the right to vote. You should, from the time you're eligible to vote, register to vote and vote in every election for the rest of your life. Not just for the president, but for the dog catcher and everything in between. That is your duty. That is your obligation. And there are some people who are saying, and I've heard it, if you excite me and inspire me to go to the polls, I'll go. If you don't, I won't. And I understand that that is a position. I don't think it is a healthy position for a democracy, because at scale, that means people don't show up and important voices aren't heard. We need to raise our voices. That's how democracy is powered. So the lack of adherence to facts, the weakening, in my view, of the judicial branch, and increasing apathy are all major threats to democracy. But the answer, the antidote, is the opposite of apathy. Robust, unapologetic, powerful activism and engagement. Running for office, voting for those in office, being engaged with your elected officials, speaking up and speaking out, not subscribing to the false position that the future will unfold before you and you're an observer and a bystander. There's nothing you can do. That is not true. You can shape the future. You can bend it to where it needs to go. That is the source of democracy's power. The people, the people's voice, at scale, expressed through the right to vote. And when people pull away from that, they give up their power and they cede democracy to some other form of government. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, I hate to cut our conversation short, but that is going to have to be, I think, the last note, because we have to get these folks to their next class at 1:30, and I know there's students waiting outside to come in. So, General, thank you so much for joining us. Professor Hasen, thank you so much for your continued work on the subject, both as a scholar and as a amici and as a leader on voting rights and democracy, not just nationally, but internationally as well. And so thank you both for lending your voices today and in the weeks and months and years to come.
And thanks to you for doing this work around the country with the ABA and the Attorneys General to try to promote our democracy.